A cascading rain beat mercilessly down on the roof of the research base and Moss sighed with frustration. The Starfinder had departed 3 hours ago and he was already bored. Flanagan was engrossed in setting up his equipment, having made it clear he did not need any assistance. He looked at the large monitor on the wall, which showed images of the surrounding area. The distant skies gave no suggestion the weather was going to change any time soon. He'd planned to start his own search of the moon, but the anti-grav sled was designed more like a motorcycle, with no canopy to protect the rider from the elements. Idly flicking the controls of the external cameras, he saw the storage container holding the sled bike which glistened as the rivulets of rain were caught in the glare of the camera's lights before they moved on to shine upon the rain-soaked lander. Jumping to his feet, he swore silently to himself as he grabbed his jacket. "I'm going out for a while," he said to Flanagan, who didn't reply, but merely waved a hand in acknowledgement. Dashing across the now sodden track, he opened the hatch of the lander, threw himself in, hurriedly closing it behind him as the rain continued to beat down. Removing his wet jacket, he went through the pre-flight checks, adjusting the internal climate controls and turning on the electromagnetic shields. The shields were primarily to protect the ship from any space debris when traveling outside of a planet's atmosphere, but in this instance, the protective barrier also kept the cameras and therefore his viewing screens free of the driving rain. Still kicking himself for not thinking of using the lander earlier, Moss pulled on the control levers and launched the tiny craft skywards. As he rose above the clouds he blinked as the bright glare of the sun was reflected back from the top of the canopy of rain clouds. Climbing higher gave him a wider view of the moon's surface. The crater they were based in seemed to have its own microclimate, as the heavy cloud cover didn't appear to extend any further than the crater's 8-kilometer diameter. The surrounding sky was largely clear of clouds and the lush terrain was mostly bathed in the reddish hue of the sun. Pushing the control levers, Moss steered the lander away from the clouds and rising still higher, he took in the varied landscape. At about 5,000 kilometers in diameter, the moon was almost twice the size of either of the two moons orbiting his home world Perseus. The area surrounding the crater was covered in a lush dense forest, which stretched for at least 100 kilometers in every direction, but beyond this to the east he could make out vast plains of grasslands leading to a great range of mountains. To the west, there were similar grassland plains with several rivers which wound their way through the grassy terrain heading towards a hazy bluey-gray horizon, which suggested the possibility of an enormous ocean although at this distance, he couldn't be certain. Moss checked to make sure what he was seeing was being recorded by the onboard computer. He knew Flanagan would be enthralled by the moon's diverse topography, as would the captain and crew of the Starfinder. If the Grondorians were not an issue, this would make a great colony world. Turning the lander he headed west, flying just above the canopy of the dense forest, hoping for a break large enough to land where he could explore on foot, but the gaps, while they did give him tantalizing glimpses of winding streams and pools of crystal-clear water, none were large enough to offer any opportunity to safely park the lander. When the weather improved he resolved, he'd come back on the sled. Glancing at the clock on his console he realized he'd been flying for over 2 hours and he'd not yet seen any sign of the lifeforms indicated by the sensor readings of the Starfinder, but quickly rationalized this given the density of the vast forest below him. He wondered if he should return to the research lab, but swiftly concluded Flanagan would call him if he was needed. Abandoning any thought of finding a landing site in the forested zone, he increased the lander's speed and pushed on towards the grasslands and gradually the tightly grouped trees began to thin out, to be replaced by an almost endless sea of open undulating land covered by lush grasses of green and purple. He followed the path of a gently flowing crystal-clear river, which slowly broadened, reaching half a kilometer wide, before narrowing sharply as it fed into a ravine carved through a range of stone-covered hills. As he flew over the rocky hills, he was greeted by a breathtaking view as the other side of the hills fell sharply away. The flowing water turned into a magnificent waterfall which plummeted 300 meters into a 3-kilometer-wide lake, the resulting plume of spray covering a third of the lake in a swirling mist. Towards the far side of the lake, Moss could see what appeared to be a small flat island, almost 60 meters across, covered in maroon-colored flowers. As he drew closer he revised his first idea, thinking instead it was a floating island of plants, like giant water lilies in full bloom. He slowed the lander and dropped down until he was skimming just a few feet above the surface of the water, closing to within 200 meters. The island exploded as 1,000 maroon-colored blooms spread their wings and launched into the air squawking loudly in a coarse throaty roar. Zooming in the camera lens, he tried to get a closer look at the fleeing creatures. The slimline body was around 2 meters long, with a high domed head and bulbous eyes and a long pointed beak lined with 2 rows of small pointed teeth. The body and the upper surface of the wings, which spanned around 4 meters, were covered with a fine coat of maroon-colored fur. The underside of the wings and the legs, which ended in webbed and clawed feet, were a deep glossy black. Moss's exhilaration at his first encounter with a native species of the moon was tempered slightly by the thought that these raptors would be a fearsome adversary, should they ever decide to attack rather than flee. The maroon cloud fled away and he pressed on, following the curves of the river as it wandered through the open grasslands heading towards another forest of bluey-green trees. Increasing his speed, he took the lander higher as he neared the leafy barrier and was surprised to find it more like a gigantic nature-built wall, no more than 200 meters deep while it extended into infinity to the left and right. As he passed over the leafy barrier into more grassy pastures he saw a fantastic sight. A large herd of browsing quadrupeds spread across the plain. Moss stared for a few moments, a huge grin spreading across his face. Fearful of causing a stampede, he instantly shut down the lander's thrusters and using the almost silent anti-grav, brought the craft down to hover 20 meters from the ground, gently closing in towards the herd. Keeping a safe 200-meter distance, he used the cameras to zoom in for a closer view. His first impression was the creatures were similar to quadrants, the pony-sized creatures looking like a cross between a cow and a pig with furry brown coats, which had been introduced on Perseus less than a century ago, but as the images grew larger, it became obvious, other than the stocky build, that's where the similarities ended. The entire body, including the lizard-like tail, was covered in a dark gray leathery coat. The head did resemble that of a pig's with small pointed ears and powerful jaws, but the eyes were large and bulbous and the larger beasts sported a single horn which projected from the creature's forehead. It was difficult to determine their size with little to give any perspective. Moss slowly moved his view closer, as he began to calculate. If the grassy vegetation was a meter tall, the young calves would be half a meter taller. The majority of the herd ranged from 2 to 3 meters tall. A few were taller and one stood out as the tallest and heaviest, standing about 4 meters at the shoulder, his shiny black horn almost a meter long. A quick look at the rest of the herd showed only the largest were equipped with a horn. It was a guess, but an educated one. These were the males and the biggest was the alpha. A loud beep on his console made Moss jump. He flicked a switch and the slightly worried-looking face of Josh Flanagan appeared on a small screen. "Are you okay, Zach?" he inquired. "You've been gone for hours? Did you miss me?" Moss gave him a cheesy grin. "I'm heading back now. I've got a lot to tell you. Is everything okay with you?" "It's all going well," replied Josh, ignoring the first question. "I'll be ready to start drilling for samples in the morning." "I'll see you soon," said Moss, punching the coordinates into the lander's navigation computer and ending the call. Moss leant back in his seat on the gray foldable sofa. It was surprisingly comfortable. He took the offered mug of coffee from Josh's outstretched hand, as his colleague seated himself on an adjacent matching sofa. He'd been bursting to tell about his day, but the talk over a dinner of rehydrated chicken and rice had been dominated by the geologist's equally enthusiastic chatter about his findings. "Everything so far points to a significant amount of latanium below the moon's surface," said Josh. "I'm going to begin drilling some test boreholes in the morning. What about you? What did you find out?" "It's been an interesting day," replied Moss. "It's a pity we're only here for a week. I could spend weeks exploring this place. I've got a lot to tell and show you. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts." Plugging in the memory stick of the images he'd recorded on the lander's cameras, he began detailing what he'd seen of the moon's landscape of forests, grasslands, rivers, and mountains. As he expected, the geologist was enthralled by the diversity of the ecology. "I have to agree," he said, "it looks like a great location for a colony world. Did you collect any samples of the plants?" "That's what I intend to do tomorrow, weather permitting," said Moss, "but we're just getting started with the recording. Wait until you see what else I found." As the film continued to play, Josh leaned forward intently as the lander flew over the winding river, jumping to his feet at the sight of the 300-meter-high waterfall. "I need to increase the intensity of my work," he said. "Our time here is limited, but I can't leave here without seeing this for myself." "Wait until you see what I discovered next," said Moss. He stopped the playback when the maroon-colored floating island centered on the screen, watching the geologist's face as he asked the question. "What are your thoughts?" "When I first saw it, I thought it was an island covered in colorful shrubs or flowers." "It's a trick question," replied Josh. "My thoughts are the same, but you wouldn't be asking if that's what it actually is. Maybe some type of phosphorescent algae?" Moss pressed the play button. The reaction when the island exploded into life was glorious, Josh once again leaping to his feet. Moss froze the image showing a close-up of the creature. "What do you make of them?" "Is it a bird," he asked, "or a flying reptile?" "It certainly has the features of a reptile," replied Josh. It doesn't have feathers and it looks to have teeth, but this world's evolution is unique, we can't apply our own history. Keep that in your mind when you see my next find, said Moss, as he fast-forwarded the recording. There's nothing to compare it to on any world I've visited, said Josh. It does seem to confirm my theory. This is a totally unique ecosystem which has evolved over millions of years. It would be a real shame if it was controlled by the Grondorians. Ross and Tennant studied the monitor screen which was showing the latest information from the advanced probes, displaying the results of the long-range scans deep into the Apius system. The search for the lost colony had yielded nothing so far and time was running out. We've still got 48 hours, said Tennant. If we make contact, we could extend it a bit. We could send a message to Zach and Josh using a probe, they should be fine for a couple of extra days. The scans are inconclusive, said Ross. There are several moons around the gas giant Jan Nix, but the results are being affected by its proximity. I hate to say it, but I think it's our last chance. If there's no sign of them on one of Janix's moons, we'll have to return to Apius 3, set a course and engage the drive at maximum speed. The vast purple planet Jan Nix loomed on the viewing screen. As they drew closer, Ross could make out several moons in the gas giant's orbit. I want a full scan of each of them, he said. Let's see if there are any signs of life. Captain, we're being scanned, said Diglis the satellite officer. It's a Grondorian battlecruiser. What's its course and speed? Ross felt the tension in his body. He hoped it didn't show in his voice. Glowing red lights flashed around the bridge and a ship-wide tannoy alerted the crew, as a red alert was initiated. Tennant was barking out orders to various section leaders over the comms system. Ross turned to Diglis. They're on a direct intercept course, sir. Their speed is difficult to calculate, but they're moving fast. Ross made multiple calculations of his own. The Starfinder was well armed for a civilian vessel, able to fend off rogue smugglers or pirates, but it couldn't take on a battlecruiser. Send out a friendly message, said Ross. Tell them we're searching for a lost starship. Keep all our weapons offline, we don't want to seem aggressive. There was no reply from the cruiser. It continued its rapid approach, its formidable stature seemingly growing larger as it bore down on the lone craft. Grondorian Commander, said Ross, taking control of the comms. This is Captain Ross of the Persian exploration vessel, Starfinder. We are on a peaceable mission to find a lost colony ship. This is a neutral zone and we offer no threat to you or your citizens. This is Captain Grunnerved of the Gronder Defense Force cruiser, Brascorville. This is Grondorian territory. You will surrender your ship and prepare to be boarded. Ross didn't reply. Given the circumstances, there was little he could say. He ended the call and gave Tennant a sideways glance. Without any further talk they both disappeared into Ross's day cabin. He didn't need to say anything further to the other bridge personnel. If they needed to tell him something urgent, they would. I don't see many options, said Ross. We can't engage with a battlecruiser. We don't know what they want, said Tennant. We have to talk to them. If they just want us to leave the system, said Ross, I'm happy to oblige them, but I'd like to know what they intend for the colonists. If they'll let us take them with us, I'm okay with that too. We don't even know if they're aware of their existence. What do you think? Given there's no sign of the colonists' ship, said Tennant after a thoughtful pause, I think it's safe to assume it's been destroyed or been stolen. Let's hope it's not what they have planned for us. We'd better find out. Their weapons will be in range in a few minutes. They returned to the bridge. Ross pressed a switch to open a communication link and hailed the Brascorville. There was no reply, but with a huge roar, a powerful force struck the ship. Ross was almost thrown from his chair. He hardly had time to strap himself into it before a second impact struck and then a third. Captain, the shields are down, reported Diglis. One more hit and we'll be blown to pieces. A fourth impact struck the now defenseless ship, but it didn't have the same destructive force as the previous ones. Ross was still reeling from the sudden barrages. He quickly gathered his thoughts, assessing what had happened. A light flashed on his panel and the voice of Engineering Officer Turnbull rang out. Captain. The main fusion drive is offline. The magnetic shields were hit, I had to shut it down before it blew up. We can repair the shields, he added, anticipating Ross's next question, but it'll take a few hours, or maybe even days.